Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is actually a talk that I am very excited about. Is on the topic of new nationalism and the rise of complex and not so pretty politics throughout the entire world. We have here some amazing people to make the conversation actually a little bit uncomfortable. That would be the idea. We have Zdenka Badovinac, who is the moderator and is a curator based in Ljubljana, director of Modern Galleria. Zeynep, who is a curator based in Istanbul. Nicolaus Schafhausen, formerly based in Vienna, now the director of the Fogo Island project. Whatever I say wrong, please correct me. And Kodwo, Eshun, and Anjalika Sagar from Otolith group, amazing, amazing artists. Zdenka is the moderator, and I very much look forward to what you have to say, all of you today. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to start the conversation about the nationalism, new nationalism. I'm here together with, if I go from my left to right, with Anjalika Sagar and Kodwo Eshun from Otolith group, Nicolaus Schafhausen, at the moment strategic director of Fogo Island Arts of Shorefast from Canada, and Zeynep, a founder of Bahar in Istanbul, and also a curator of the actual Turkish pavilion in Venice Biennale at the moment. So the purpose of our conversation is to reflect on the new-old nationalism and, of course, populism, even new neo-fascism that we witness today, not only in Europe, but all around the world. Of course, nationalism is nothing new. But what is new are the circumstances that shape whatever we call nationalism or neo-nationalism. So the circumstances in Europe and in other places of the world are rapidly changing. And of course, we know that the key cause of the changes is global capitalism. But there are, of course, also other things that somehow are again the results of this global neoliberalism. On the first place, this is the migrant crisis, and we can go also further in the recent history. We can go to the September 11th that caused many problems to the people that have been defined as a terrorist after it. So the people that are of mostly of the Muslim religions. So the vocabulary in contemporary politics changed a lot. So the ideology of neoliberal politics, the key word until recently was open borders. So today we hear a lot about the protectionism, about sovereignism, and about safety. So these are again the new old words that somehow defined what the frame that we can discuss nationalism in. So the nationalism, of course, today has different faces. We know the nationalism in Europe. I am coming from Eastern Europe, from Slovenia, so in the former Yugoslavia, there are many changes. So if you go, for example, to Skopje, which is the most astonishing places at the moment in the Balkans. You will see many new nationalist monuments. So Skopje became a new brand in terms of, attracting the tourists with those monuments. And also they covered the modernist architecture, modernist building facades, the buildings that were built in times of socialism with classicistic facade. So in Europe, of course, Brexit is another issue that is again something else that here in the continental Europe we talk about in terms of nationalism. In UK, the discussion of nationalism relates very much also to the people of color. So the discourse is different there. And if we go, for example, to Asia, again, I was recently reading about new gulag in China, where 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims are now undergoing the re-education programs. So the word nationalism in Europe and elsewhere is very often today accompanied with the word fascism. And we are discussing a lot whether this word is too heavy to define what is going on today. But also those who would not agree to use such a heavy word would certainly agree that on other issues that are related to fascism, and this is nationalism, populism, and xenophobia. So, of course, the debate, our debate will tackle more the question of art institution and art. So how all this new situation made impact on our work and what can we do, what can be done. So I propose we start our conversation again the way I introduced you, or should we go opposite from you? Yeah. Okay, with the artist. So this is democratic panel. We will have a conversation, but if there are urgencies from your side, please just ask, just interrupt us. So it's very open debate. So I would like to start then with Anjalika, but I would first introduce very shortly the Otolith group. The Otolith group was founded in 2002 and consists of the artists and theorists of Anjalika, Sagar and Kodwo, Eshun, who live and work in London. Their ongoing research-based collaboration draws from a wide range of resources and materials that supports intergenerational dialogue with other artists and thinkers. The group also functions as curators on the platform titled the Otolith Collective. This visual art duo work with moving images, installations with archival film, video, photography, performance curation, and publication. Their work is developed according to a shifting series of long-term research-based projects exploring the legacies and potentialities of proposals broadly informed by architecture, the Bandung Conference, the experimental film, continentalism, cybernetics, science fiction, and Kapilatozen. The term Otolith, maybe I'll leave this to you later if somebody is interested to go deeper in the explanation of your work. So I would just start with a question to you both. So you recently opened a large-scale exhibition, the Otolith group, Xenogenesis, in Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, where you took as a point of their departure Octavia Butler's text, genesis. So xeno means strange or alien, and genesis is becoming. And your work in these terms relates to science fiction, inhuman, and migration. So my question would be why Butler's writing is so important for you? Why is so relevant today?
Well, Octavia Butler is an extraordinary figure for us for many reasons. Firstly, I'd suggest to everybody here, if you haven't read any Octavia Butler, and you have read Ursula Le Guin or other sort of white science fiction writers, I would urge you to read Octavia Butler, because she brings a whole other energy into and politics into science fiction, and that is of the inhuman, or that which is considered inhuman. And she looks at apocalypse deeply and actually predicts it. She predicts kind of what is happening now. She predicted it in the 70s and the 80s. The term xenogenesis means to kind of estrange yourself and grow, I suppose, at the same time. Become alien, become estranged. And I think the question of the present in relation to this is a very, I mean, you know, one can talk about it for a long time, but, you know, when we talk about fascism, we are not just talking about fascism in the way that we understood it before, are we, really? We're talking about it in a very, it's appearing in a very different way now. It's actually kind of like it's being organized and run by people who are openly stupid and are openly mobsters. It's kind of like the return of the East India Company, but without any of the charm, but openly. And, you know, there is a sense that this world is, as it is ending. You know, if it's a white, patriarchal, hegemonic power that has run everything till now, which it has, it's got to end. You know, if you leave imperialists and people who've been imperialists alone without having to deal with people of color or women of color or disabled people or, you know, people who are queering or people who are just struggling to base a society on difference. If imperialists do not understand that those other people have rights, then they will just do it again, you know, which is what is happening, you know. And I think when it comes to the UK and a city like London, one can say that London is a city which has had a long history of multi-ethnic rebellion. One could say this is the left, in a way, you know. Multi-ethnic rebellion has been in place since shipbuilding started, due to the, you know, Enclosure Acts and all of that. So I think when we think about xenogenesis, we think about the potential that comes from thinking beyond this world and thinking of this world as an end. Thinking of that doesn't mean to abandon the institutions, but it certainly means to decolonize them. So I think poetics is perhaps the last space of practice. All the genres have been captured. All of the, I don't know, it feels like everything has been kind of captured. So perhaps poetics, or as Denise Ferreira da Silva writes about in her text, Towards the End of the World, a black feminist poetics, perhaps it's a poetics that we think about as a way to apprehend the idea of the essayistic in our work, in our films.
You know, I think the question of new nationalisms and their relation to art institutions, that immediately compels us to think through the notion that, Europe has never not been nationalist. So instead of, or as well as pointing to the novelty of nationalism, I think the continuities of nationalism are important. And as for me, how nationalisms bear on the art institution, the institution of the art fair, is through the structured subordination of the art world. That's to say, the segregation that structures art world. So in Europe, at the moment, you have this phenomenon of the rediscovery of artists of color. So in Britain, the so-called rediscovery. So in Britain, you have great artists from the 1980s, such as Claudette Joseph. You have artists such as Frank Bowling at Tate Britain. You have these artists who've been working for 20, 50, 60 years, who have their moment 30, 40 years later. What this suggests is an unequal integration and a hierarchical structure which is continuous with the Cold War. I've been researching a lot on the notion of Cold War containment, the Truman Doctrine, the 1950s. But when I look at the art world, I'm not sure we were never not in a Cold War, because the logics of containment, the logics of subordination, are part of what explains the excitement around artists of color now. Why were these artists exclusively included? Why were they excluded in order to be partially included in art history, in art surveys, in so-called group shows, in historical shows? Why is art history, why is art theory, why is art practice, why is curating taught at the level of unequally integrated, hierarchical, structured subordination of certain artists from other artists? So so my initial notion is to stress the continuity of nationalism and the particular role that plays within art institutions. Of course, coming from Britain, Britain has its own idioms of neo-nationalism. We don't have Trump, we have Rees-Mogg. In Britain, neo-nationalism wears +4s and it speaks in an Etonian accent. That's the particular malaise of Britain, which has formed us. And so the question of xenogenesis has to be put in that context, a context of the particular inflections that Britain brings to what is clearly a global crisis. I would characterize this global crisis in the words of the neo-reactionary thinker Nick Land, who doesn't use terms such as fascism or populism, but speaks in terms of drastically advanced regression. Drastically advanced regression. This is useful because it's a certain kind of diagram, a certain kind of political diagram that lets us map a conjuncture in a very general way. But we can see examples of drastically advanced regression all the time. We can see the combinations of belligerent, regressive forces multiplied by computational, algorithmic power at a massively multiplied scale. That combination of the regressive plus the digitally advanced, I would say is what is unique to our time. Plus, of course, the 11-year timeline that we are living in, the timeline given to us by the IPCC, who, we have to reduce whoever we are, as opposed to reduce the global temperature below 1.5 otherwise, as we know, the coastal regions of the planet, the island nations of the planet, and specifically the majority of people in the African continent will suffer the consequences of the 60 or 70 corporations whose names we now know, who are based in Switzerland, in the US, in the UK, and whose names are very clear. These people are set to destroy the planet, and specifically the specific numbers of African peoples who have done the least to cause the catastrophe that we are in. So we live in a world, I would say, where the challenge for us as artists is to think on an interscalar level. We look a lot at the work of the historian of science, Gabrielle Hecht, and in her analysis of the African Anthropocene, how the Anthropocene looks from the perspective of the African continent. She talks a lot about interscalar vehicles as a way of narrating these kinds of scales that we have to confront. So xenogenesis for us is a way of opening up this dimension of a vehicle, narrative vehicles, image vehicles, sonic vehicles, which can travel across the scales of the drastically advanced regression that we are now facing.
Thank you. I think you opened a very important question of repetition, of, that these things like fascism and nationalism are actually part of us. So it's something probably that we need to discuss as well. So we need to probably come, maybe not here, but include in our discussion also the aspect of psychoanalysis. So, and I would now give the word to Nicolaus Schafhausen. Of course, I would present you first. First, I thought about Zeynep, but now, as I thought, as I mentioned psychoanalysis, I said, oh, the Vienna, the city which is strongly related to you, the city of Freud. Although we are not talking about him here, but still maybe this association to have in our somewhere. Yeah, it's also okay. So Nicolaus Schafhausen is a curator, director, author, and editor of numerous publications on contemporary art. Since 2011, he has been the strategic director of Fogo Island Arts, an initiative of the Canadian Shorefast Foundation to find alternative solutions for the revitalization of the area that is prone to emigrations. Since 2019, Schafhausen has been the artistic director of the exhibition and educational project Tell Me About Yesterday, Tomorrow, and the Munich Documentation Center of the History of National Socialism, which brings contemporary artistic positions and current approaches to an exchange with institutional remembrance work. Schafhausen has extensive experience leading renowned institutions such as the Frankfurter Kunstverein, the Künstlerhaus, Stuttgart, and Witte de Wit Center in Rotterdam. Schafhausen was the founding director of European Kunsthalle, conceived as a project to examine the conditions and structures of contemporary art institutions independent of local government mandates. Co-curator of the 6th Moscow Biennale Biennale in 2015. Schafhausen is also a visiting lecturer at HISK, Higher Institution of Fine Arts in Ghent. He has curated a number of international festivals and exhibitions. And to make it shorter, in 2017 and 2009, he was the curator of German Pavilion for the 52nd and 53rd Venice Biennial and for the 56th Venice Biennial in 2015, he curated the Kosovo Pavilion. From October 2012 to the end of March 2019, Nicolaus Schafhausen was the director of the Kunsthalle Vienna. And this is already this last position relates also to my first question, and now I will read the last part of his CV as he sent it to me, and this would be also a little provocation, Nicolaus, for you to try to explain this, what is written here, a little bit more in details. So it goes like that. In May 2018, he announced that he would step down his post on 31st March 2019 for political reasons, as he saw the effectiveness of cultural institutions such as the Kunsthalle Vienna being questioned for the future in view of the current nationalist policy in Austria and the European situation. In times of right-wing populist movements, it would require a much stronger support on the part of national cultural policy. So what does it mean, Nicolaus?
Well, this is a quote, what you were reading, and I re-quoted again. I gave to Art magazine last year after my decision to leave, or when I announced my departure of this institution. Indirectly, they have answered it. Yeah, it's it's always strange to listen to a CV like this, but what it says, to make a long story short, my experience of the last 25 years were directing several institutions across Europe and partly in Canada, and after such a long record of being director of institutions, I realized that, and you know it too, I think we all know it, running institutions require reform. An everyday practice. And in a way, I personally came to a dead end where I couldn't play anymore the opposition towards the audience, towards the media, towards the artists, towards people who are visiting us. I'm not so sure anymore for what we are for. So of course I'm talking from the institutional field, from the public institutional field. I left that position in the end of the day, it was a personal decision, of course. Yeah. But when you look, I'm not Austrian. Yeah, I think I have to make that clear. And even as a German in Austria, I suffered from xenophobia. So I know that for a white person, so speaking the language, how does that fit together? So, but if you look a little bit, and I don't want to blame the Austrian citizenry, but if you look into Austria as a very wealthy, well-functioning former Western European country, I think you can learn a lot. So those institutions, all the public institutions, museums, universities, and etc., are operating inside a comfort zone, which we're all aware of, but to whom? And I'm not talking about visitor numbers. To whom do we reach out and what for? And there I see the limits. There I really see the limits. I don't think that we can reform those institutions from the inside. I really think that we have to look for new models, not to attack those institutions, but for new models, getting a political backup for those institutions and make them more visible. And that means politics come into the game. So politics are really not interested in those institutions, especially not in a country like Austria or Germany or Switzerland. We are operating in a, again, for the so-called elite, in which we are definitely operating in. And this elite is important for us operating in the system itself and earning our money, making our life. And we are almost a very rich vessel for the right wings, we consider them as right wings, all the right-wing parties, to be the enemy. So, and that is, I think we need to be aware of this, that we are part of the enemy, and we are not really doing the right political thing to reach out to others. I'm not, I think that's the dilemma and the conflict in which we are operating, and not only we as curators and directors of institutions, also artists, because the role of artists, not only from your individual practice, from where you're arguing from, but the question, I think, in the future will be, does this really matter what you do for society as large? So it's, I left that position from a comfort zone, of course, not because I wanted to put myself in the victim role, but I realized where this politics, which is definitely the nationalistic politics and policy in Austria, as an example, it's a small country. It's so, because of its smallness, I think you can research it a little bit better to learn from it and do it better. But this is not really happening in the country itself, because it's very self-centered with their daily problems. So
now we are already in the question of institutions and the models of cultural production that obviously need to change. I'm also working in the institution, in the National Museum, and I think there must be something that we need to think, and we need to change the institutions with other agencies from outside institutions. So it's not enough.
No. I think we have limits to change the institutions. We need to be more political. We need to have more political power. So and also individuals, private foundations. We always talk about private foundations, how fantastic, how great they are. But the problem is most of them are operating on their own behalf. So it means they stay in their own system instead of trying to change the system, just giving the money away for other purposes. That's, I think, one of the main and the biggest. The whole foundation model has to change. It means the tax system has to change, the control system, the bureaucratic system has to change, and I think you will talk about this
Okay, so we move to Zeynep then. Zeynep Öz, with her rich experience as a curator based in Istanbul, currently running the project Bahar. She's the curator of, as I said before, the Pavilion of Turkey at the 58th International Art Exhibition in Venice, and the Baka Award exhibition of Marwa Rashmawi at the Bonaventure Museum in 2019. She was one of the interlocutors of the Sharjah Biennale 13, curating the Biennale's Offsite project in Istanbul in 2017, as well as a co-curator of the Aisha Triennial 3 in 2016. Öz was the co-founder and director of the Spot Production Fund from 2011 to 2017, during which she curated the produced Syria 1, 2, 3. She also curated the film program, Greatest Common Factor, at SALT Istanbul in 2016, the project Plastic Venice at Homeworks 6, Ashkal Alvan, Beirut 2013, and Selling Snails in the Muslim Neighborhood at the Westfälischer Kunstverein Münster 2013. This has been on the curricular and selection committees of Home Workspace program of Ashkal Alvan in Beirut since 2015. So Zeynep, we are already in the middle of discussion of different model of cultural production, so we can continue this question with you on the institution work. And you, I think for me, you are really special here in terms how much you work with the production of artworks. You know, I think that we, in our conferences, wherever, we talk a lot about the institutions, art in general, but not enough about the production. So this is really unique that we have you here. And so my question would be about your concrete work with art production. And I would ask you also to relate it to the concrete situation in Turkey, not only political, but also, you know, the situation dominated by the private sector mostly, which is not our case.
Yeah, thank you. Pick up on what Nicolaus is saying, indeed, in Istanbul, it's very much the case that we have a lot of private sport, patronage, and sport comes usually from private hands. In terms of contemporary art, most of the time, public and national sport is very absent. So I think I'm trying to also think about what you said, Nicolaus, and like relate it back to that. But maybe I'll just start from my experience and extrapolate on that, and you can we can try to bring them together. But yeah, as you said, I usually at least in terms of the work that I've been doing in Istanbul, where I've been based for about 10 years now, and that work is a lot about commissioning new works and trying to work with artists on the ground. And what I've found, I think what's going on a lot in the last 3 years, and this is not as you said, Produce was a series that I worked on for about 7 or 8 years, and that was funded by a very specific project called Spot that I co-founded, and then Bahar was actually founded as funded by Sharjah Art Foundation. It was the offsite project for the Sharjah Biennial 13, but this would be something that I'm talking about in terms of the commissioning work that I do on the ground. But I'm actually how I'm going to answer this in a convoluted way. I'm coming to it. How I'm going to answer this is I'm thinking about my experience of trying to work with artists on the ground, but I'm also thinking of institutions who are on the ground, such as people like Depo. There are initiatives that are coming up like Poche, A Corner in the World. There are initiatives that do a lot of the work that I do. And when I think of funding in the sport and the organizational system in Istanbul, I think there are a lot of institutions that have been ongoing for a while now that are supported in turn by big institutions, be they banks or be they big families, big sport, big funders. Then there are initiatives that are ongoing on the ground that are much more smaller, that are more initiative, that are more where the artistic production is going on. And something that I can talk to within the framework of our panel, which is talking about the recent years and the rising nationalisms and the rising way in which things are sort of going in terms of cultural policies, real policies are going in a certain direction. I think cultural policies are following up because they always do. And then, of course, funding follows just right tailing on. What I've been noticing in the last 2 or 3 years is that I think the kind of funding that is for these initiatives, that is more about the organic things that are going on the ground for artists that are younger and that are, you know, like not as well formulated and that are not expressing things that are, you know, like just big and huge, it's dwindling. I think this is something that is, I mean, it's very easy, and we always say that funding is always dwindling, but I think there's a reason why this is dwindling. And the reason is that I think the kind of work, and when I say work, it means also like exhibitions, I'm also talking about publications, I'm talking about writing, thinking, all of the work that is more, that is not as well established, that doesn't have that type of immunity that comes from a big track record, is seen as too risky to be supported, because it's not there. It might just like crack a political nerve. It might just go on a political fault line, and then something might just go off. And this is something that I think a lot of funders find too risky to stand behind. And this is why I think in the last 2 or 3 years, especially, like I'm talking about the experience of Istanbul and what I've been seeing and feeling on the ground, but I think it like goes to the region that I know a little bit more about, and then I guess you could like think about it bigger. I think what's going on is that like these kinds of risks are having less and less of a space to be talked about. The other thing, specifically in Istanbul, that I'm seeing and I'm thinking about is that we have a lot of funds for process-based works right now, like process-based, either educational programs and residencies and all of this. And I always am for, you know, like a big supporter of these. But I think the reason, again, I'm going to tie it back to exactly what I was saying. I think one of the reasons why this is happening is that it's not production-based. Process-based means like not production, not product focus. There's nothing that's going to come in material form and say, like, stand right here that people are going to be attacked. If you're supporting something that's very much process-based, it's amazing. Like, don't get me wrong, I totally am behind this. I've been advocating this forever. This is what I do. But at the same time, I think there's a reason why this is the type of infrastructure that's coming to be more and more in Istanbul, because I don't think there's as much space for very clear, full-bodied cultural and political stance to be shown and then to be attacked, because they might be attacked. So I'll maybe stop there and you can... By whom? Like, I think everyone. Like, I think, like... you and me, like all of us, I think there's a little bit of a, like, less of a room for tension. Like you spark a, what do you call it? You spark a fire and it might you light a match and it might spark a fire, that kind of a tension going on. But I think just like, it might be something on the newspapers, it might be like a general public situation. And I think that's more of like what's scary.
Very interesting. So it means also that there is still, there are people who still believe in power of art somehow, you know, because, you know, if the art is, you know...
Indeed. And I think, by the way, like when I say these, like I'm afraid, like I just want to put it like very well on the ground that I think censorship and self-censorship are like very much vitally like tangible in like Istanbul specifically right now. It's like, it's something on our minds. It's not like at the back of my mind, it's on the front of my mind in a lot of people. So it's not a like thing, but I'm just saying, like, I think there are ways of dealing with this that are, yeah.
Can I ask a question? You know, this self-censorship, not censorship, self-censorship. You know, in institutions, in public institutions, this is, I think it's common practice. We are already over that step. So it's I know, you know, we all know so many curators. We also have to criticize our colleagues and curators. They do it on their own, also on their own behalf. They don't want to have any conflicts and etc. But my question would be to the artists. So and I don't think that you self-censor yourself, but what is your expectation from public institutions? As a political expectations, beyond,
Well, yeah, I mean, I think about that a lot.
Yeah.
Because I grew up inside it, in the middle of London, where Camden Arts Centre was actually a place you could go for extracurricular activity. You could go to Camden Arts Centre and you could learn to draw, or you could go and do, it was actually like an adult education, space. It wasn't necessarily just a gallery. So that sense of a public institution being almost like a kind of community centre has gone, completely gone. So also something I noticed from quite a while ago was that, suddenly after the kind of, as Kodwo was talking about in relation to artists of colour in the UK, remembering Clarissa Feely, Steve McQueen, Yinka, this kind of period, thinking, the public institutions are interested in artists of colour because, of course, they live in the middle of the belly of the beast and they understand how to think kind of with producing, I think of this as a kind of resistant aesthetics. That's quite a complicated idea, but I would say that that's kind of what I'm thinking about. I keep thinking about that. And also this space for convivial antagonism, which is what you need as a space of argument with people who are different to you, right? A place where argument can happen. But the sense that this was kind of replaced, so, for instance, there was a huge amount of pressure put on the Arts Council of England to say, from this generation of Stuart Hall and past Stuart Hall, that publicly funded institutions need to have representation of people of colour from the UK on their boards and etc., and they need to be more attentive to their programs. Right? I did one of those programs like 20 years ago, where I was literally felt like a guerrilla on the front line inside a racist institution of kind of Englishness, which was very twee and kind of impenetrable, upper class twee Englishness. A theatre organisation calling itself international, but anyway. Later I started to notice that they were inviting a lot of artists from elsewhere, from Africa, from India, as if they were kind of more authentic than artists right there in the middle of Britain. And I realised maybe it's because they want to invite them so they can send them home, because actually they don't have, to deal with them. Like in London, they don't have to deal with like loudmouths like us, who are going to be critical of the institution. They're going to be like, oh, welcome, we're very happy to be here. Thank you for giving us your entire floor of a museum or whatever. So there is that sense that always a prophet abroad, but I do expect that the public institutions in Britain are now basically strangled by managerial language. So they have to write. You have to write all these. Your bureaucracy is just it strangles you. What are your key performance indicators? And what is happening is that there is a sense that nobody is talking to people who are different to them. Nobody's thinking about class. Education is programs are not even that interesting anymore. These institutions should be far more attentive to thinking around adult education. But all of this was kind of under, a Labour government, or would be under a Labour government. But it is a complete threat to the elites to have people who are from a lower class educated. And we grew up feeling like it's great to be an intellectual, but we're not going to be snobs.
Yeah, you want? Or
after you?
No, just go on.
Okay, I just, if I can like sort of think about what you're saying, and like you're talking about like I don't know the context of the UK so well, but I'm just like sort of going off of what you said. You're talking about like the race issues sort of being codified in like a certain kind of institutional model. That's what you're referring to, and what I feel like I'm referring to as like the invisibility of like the small institutions and production in the name of like bigger, like gigantic like places. And I hear like Nicolaus sort of like saying like we need new models out of these. And I'm just like actually like it's sort of a prompt to like say like, do you have I mean this can be like anyone, and maybe like I don't know, like the context of Ljubljana, what is like, I guess like that's too big of a broader question like to say what's a new model, but like from which to jump into thinking about like these models, like yeah.
No, I don't have a specific idea what a new model can be, but that's one of the reasons why I stepped out of the existing model to work on this in my working future, you know, which I still have. This is, of course, I'm not talking about tomorrow, but it will be definitely a long process. It needs definitely new financial models to support or to new models or institutions as such. You said you were talking about the bureaucratic structures, yeah, that suffocations, and this is not just that's not just a UK problem. So those, you know, what I said earlier, institutions require reform. We know that, and I think and they do it all the time. But we also realize that this is not really working. So that means they need to be attacked from the outside. And now institutions are attacked from the outside, but more from the political agendas from the right-wing field. Yeah. Yeah. So, and we have to learn from this. So, and to definitely to take those strategy over. So we only can change institutions from the outside. So not only from the inside, or both, and of course, yeah. And if we look into who gets appointed at the moment, directors play a more important role than ever as the public faces of such institutions. And I'm a little bit worried about who gets appointed for such institutions. Most of the people are not speaking out. So, you know.
It means, you know, from outside, it means also, it not excludes inside. It doesn't exclude our work. So it is very important that we change the institution together with our constituencies. It's more about, you know.
I agree, but we are not enough from the inside. So we need to look for new alliances from the outside.
Alliance.
And this is
more alliance.
And this is money. So only money, you know, can change this.
Okay, I think it's time for the questions from the audience.
My question is actually for Anjalika. If you were talking about, can you hear me? Anjalika, when you were talking about decoloniality, I'm wondering if you situate that within the institution or without, or a mixture of both.
I mean, I wanted Kodwo to talk about, I wanted Kodwo to say something. Hopefully he was going to say something about movements. I mean, there are movements going on. There are existing groups already doing this unlearning. There are kind of groups of younger people, constellations of people who are thinking not just as artists, but also in terms of unions, as workers, how they can, you know, be together to rethink their spaces. There's all kinds of new groups emerging outside of the institutions. But when I talk about decolonizing the institution, yes, I think it has to be a mixture of both the outside and the inside, because, as Nicolaus said, The pressure is from the right wing. The right wing want to perform multiple enclosure acts so that nobody speaks. So they want to prevent institutions from growing. It is the glass ceiling that is imbricated deep within the structure of the institution. So the glass ceilings are there are walls, not just ceilings now. There are walls, there are cocoons, there are spaces you cannot get in. So that's how I pictured it when you were talking about it.
This is exactly the problem.
So I think the decolonization, what is it at the service? It has to be a political agenda, because the right wing don't want to deal with multiple forms of difference. They don't want to deal with different humans. They don't want to deal with what has been cast as the inhuman, which is matter. They don't want to think about the rights of other forms of life and other structures. So that is why I was talking about the end of the world. So the sense of how to restructure actually, I think, requires new technology that has to be in the hands of us. So I think about that as a black algorithm.
I mean, there's you know, there's several notions, several projects underway under the umbrella term of decolonizing. You know, on one hand, you've got the impact of the coloniality of power theorists, Annabelle Quijano, Walter Minolo. You've got a kind of the delayed response to their thinking over 2 decades, which has moved in as the earlier wave of post-colonial theory has somewhat receded. At the same time, you also have the ongoing work on settler colonial thinking, the critique of settler colonialism, figures like Glenn Coulthard. So I think you have both of these happening simultaneously, and then both of these are charged by the fatalism and euphoria of climate catastrophe, which creates a certain kind of it charges all these existing debates such that they overflow their academic complexes and start to circulate. So for us, there is a lot of energy in trying to connect to these debates, which are disputes and arguments over the future of the world. The debates in America around Afro-pessimism, figures such as Christina Sharp, figures such as Saidiya Hartman, older figures such as Hortense Spillers, these black feminist thinkers have a huge impact in Britain. Our students, our friends are studying these people all the time. Their theories are, they impact on people's thoughts. At the same time, all of this travels through us through platforms. So a lot of this is coming through platform scholarship. That's to say, you know, as many people are watching, for example, the African-American feminists who gathered around Simone Lee at Guggenheim, around her Loophole of Retreat exhibition. So I'm in London, but I'm watching that because Guggenheim recorded that. So a lot of people in London spend their time studying recordings from, Vimeo or Google, and in a way building study from that. And the term study means a lot to us. Study as in how Fred Moten and Stefano Hani talk about black study and black studies being the formal study of the end of Western civilization, as C.L.R. James calls it, and then black study being what you do with your friends. In a way, study helps us to cut across the notion of research, which is somewhat stultified and somehow captured in academic credentials and academic protocols. Study moves on a diagonal between the informal and the kind of the specific. So all of these questions, to me, are part of what is at stake in the question of decoloniality. So I know there are specific movements in the States around decolonizing the museum, and I know in Britain we have parallels, but I'm much more interested in the energies that effloresce when debates that begin as academic debates move and take on a certain intensity. And in a way, that's part of what Suhail Malik calls the para-academic. I mean, so Suhail he's quite critical because he says, you know, asking art spaces, I'm not necessarily talking about epic art spaces, I'm more talking about so-called small-scale organizations. Asking art to play a pedagogic role, asking it to, in a way, supplement the insufficiency of the academy, he says, is not really, that's not necessarily a progressive position to take. I can see what he means, but for me, there's an energy that comes when a certain form of study emerges, and it speaks to a yearning to upgrade vocabulary and to, in a way, what Reza Negrestani calls to upgrade one's commitments, to renew one's commitments. There are commitments, but these commitments need refreshing.
Okay, so
you should take over definitely institutions. Yeah, I totally agree. But I want to pick up your black algorithms. What you said, I think this is extremely, Anjalika, extremely important. We did a little in Munich, a little for the Center for National, the history of National Socialism, a bit of research about all the black algorithms, and you can learn from that a lot. So, and we have to work the whole field, the critical field. Let's call it the critical art field, has to work on how to change the algorithms. Yeah. This is, and if you Google this, what we are doing here, it's all about the elite, the money. So you know, the self-centered system we are all again operating in within this, and this is not mirroring the reality. So that goes, yeah. Sorry, it's
okay.
your.
Unfortunately, 1 hour is not. There is one urgent question. Yeah. Okay. And then. Yeah.
Short question, talking about money. Have you been to the Biennale? Some of you have been to the Biennale in Venice.
I think,
well, if you go to the cafe bars inside the Biennale, and you eat a croissant or you eat a sandwich, you have an amount of plastic that you can cover the planet. So, talking about reality and not talking about academic conceptions, I would suggest that Mr. Rugov to go and have a coffee, because it is a disaster the way that in the Biennale you are destroying the planet, which is just a paradox. Don't you think so?
Well, I would say that plastic comes from people's minds. You know, you can look at particles of plastic and they originate from the mind of masters of broken earths. So, as Catherine Yusuf would write in her book, The Black Anthropocene. So, it's, you know, the petrochemical industry is responsible for plastic. And the deadly bind that one is in, that many of these art, you know, but I agree, you know, I always go around saying, where are your paper straws, you know?
Okay, maybe this is a nice conclusion. We should think about more about the commonalities, and this plastic is obviously the common problem. It's more and more urgent to work on our commonalities than on our differences. Against nationalism. Thank you very much for excellent contributions. 1 hour is never enough, but we can continue later somewhere.
Thank you to Giulietta as well for inviting us.
Yeah, that's what we forgot to say at the beginning. Thank you, Giulietta.